All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second of our student-led webinars this spring. If you missed our first student-led webinar, it was about design thinking, and you can view the recording on our IDN YouTube channel, or we also have it linked through our Blackboard community and our Facebook group. If anyone needs access to those things, just let me know. And our third and final webinar of the semester is going to be coming up on April 26th at 8 p.m. So a slightly different time change than the rest. So just make note of that. And Denisa Norman from the class of 2020 is going to be talking about imposter syndrome. She's going to go over both like what imposter syndrome is and how we can work to overcome it. So I hope that you'll join us for that one as well in a couple weeks. But tonight we're very excited to have this important discussion about the transition from K-12 teaching into instructional design roles. This topic is something I've been hearing about from students, from colleagues and friends who are looking to make this move out of teaching. And I definitely want to keep really good teachers in the classroom, and it makes me sad that so many people want to leave right now. But I also understand the unique stress that so many of you have been placed under in the past couple of years. And so we wanted to set up this webinar with someone who has experience making this transition. I think instructional design is a really nice pivot out of K-12 teaching into something where you can continue to do the things that you really enjoy, but less of the stress that you have to deal with in the classroom. So tonight's presenter is Baylee Howard. She graduated in 2017, which feels like forever ago. I think you must have been in one of the first couple classes of the program, so we're really happy to have you back. Baylee started her career as a social studies teacher here in Connecticut. After completing her instructional design degree with us at Quinnipiac, she transitioned into the role of multimedia design specialist at Northeastern University in Boston. And then from there, she moved into a corporate setting. And over the past several years, looking at her LinkedIn, she just keeps moving up into different positions at the company. So she has a ton of experience to share with you as an instructional designer. And she's prepared a presentation. So like I said earlier, if you have questions, you want to put them in the chat, or we can have a little question period at the end. So with all of that said, I will turn things over to you, Baylee.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really nice to always interact with you. This program was definitely life-changing for me, and I find myself talking about the ID program even still very regularly. So I'm always happy to be back in touch. Just gonna go ahead and share my screen for you so that you can see kind of what I've put together. Most of my friends are still teachers, right? So I kind of end up having this conversation frequently with people who are just feeling a little bit overwhelmed and feeling burdened. I know when I was a teacher, it's the best job ever until it's not, until it really feels too overwhelming. So I get that. So I was a teacher for 5 years in my home city, and that was kind of a shock. I never really expected to be a teacher. It wasn't on my radar. And then I went to school, I went to URI, and I thought I was going to be out living on a ship in Alaska, studying stellar sea lions. And then I thought, no, maybe I'll be an archaeologist. So I had some kind of crazy life plans those first years out of high school. But what I realized is it's just kind of that I loved learning. And I could dive into almost any topic and just find that learning process really interesting. So history is where I landed, and I started teaching. And as much as I loved my students and my colleagues, and I really found that I loved designing creative lessons and engaging things. And I was always trying new tools and, just finding ways to interest my students. I taught in New London. So if you're familiar with Connecticut schools, New London, it's a pretty tough place to teach. And you have to have high interest lessons to get everybody on the same page. So I loved that part, but I'm a fixer and I kept trying to fix things, and I was there first and leaving last. And it became a lot. So I took kind of what I loved from teaching and I started Googling those keywords and throwing them out there. Everybody was like, you need your master's in ed. And I thought, well, I don't know if this is where I'm going to land. And that's kind of how I found QU, is it just had all the keywords, and instructional design was not really a household name at that time. So it really kind of helped me discover that there's this field out there that I didn't know about. And over the years, it definitely has. It takes all the pieces that I loved of teaching and combines them with some other great things. And really has been something awesome. So I did start at Northeastern as a multimedia design specialist, which is slightly different than instructional design. And I'll kind of get into how that plays out. But I got to be the ID expert for the multimedia design team. So it was almost a kind of like not a split role, but at times I felt like I was doing a lot of the explaining about why we design things certain ways and why instructional designers are asking for a video to include some details and pare down other details. So it was a really good way of getting a crash course in lots of different tools. So if you see multimedia design specialist as a position and you like the tech side of things, that might be one to kind of keep an eye on, because it gave me a lot of great experience that I still use now. And it helps me communicate better with our graphic designers and all the other parties involved, because I've kind of done a little bit of that role. So where I am now, so I went back for my doctorate a little bit, and I kept trying to figure out what research, area, and maybe that'll help me figure out my next career step. And higher ed is, it's big and it's vast. And I taught in my home city. So it was a big change for me. And I thought it was my dream job, just like teaching. But over time, I realized I wanted something smaller, where I could feel more heard. And I started looking into corporate settings, but I still love learning. So I found the company where I am now, which is Quimby. And we create study aids for lawyers, continuing legal education courses for attorneys, and pretty much anything a law student up to a practicing attorney would need in terms of education stuff. So it sounds, kind of plain and boring, but it's a company that specializes in doing study aids in a way that's really creative. So instructional design opens up a lot of doors to things I just didn't know existed. So as far as the common things that seem to come up, and please just speak up anytime. You can throw anything you want in the chat. You can just unmute and start talking. I just put together some things that come up frequently when my own friends are asking me kind of, what do you do? And do you miss your classroom? And what was it really like? Because yes, I miss my classroom some days, but like I said, before we got started, if you were with us, you just find other ways of filling that in. So here are the big things anyway that kind of stand out. The first one being lots of people, or at least I really could not visualize what it would look like to be an instructional designer versus a teacher. How would that change, and what would that actually look like? So one thing that we see a lot now that I'm on the hiring side of things is there's this confusion between designing instruction being the same thing as instructional design. And I think it's almost become something that like HR can kind of look for and say, like, does this teacher really have the instructional design skills, or do they think it's the same as just everyday designing of instruction, right? Because teachers do that all the time. But like you've learned, if you're in the program or you've gone through it, there's kind of this specialized skill set and body of knowledge that instructional designers work from. So there's a ton of overlap, but it's also just important for your own thinking and for others to know and realize that you see the distinction. And so here are the things that stood out to me when I was a K-12 teacher. You still use backwards design for my own lessons, units, curriculum. The people I was working with were mostly kids, families, colleagues, administration, maybe central office, if you do a lot of committees or that sort of thing. As far as research, we were talking a lot about Bloom's taxonomy or Maslow's hierarchy of needs or depth of knowledge, all those sorts of planning frameworks. I did, as teachers do, all the planning and creating of my materials, sometimes sourcing, but I tended to create most of what I was using to teach. So handouts, some multimedia, right? If you've been teaching since COVID, you've probably done more multimedia creation than I would have, but I dabbled in some animated videos with simple tools. Or when I was in the QU program, my students were great guinea pigs for things with Captivate, and stuff like that. So there was, a tiny bit of that, but mostly printables and the average stuff that you kind of associate with a physical classroom. And then some K-12 online tools. We had like a pretty primitive LMS that we were working with. And there were occasional times where I got the kids to do like VoiceThread, when I was trying out different tools. Classroom management, was a huge thing, and social emotional stuff. Every lunch was spent with a crying child somewhere. That was a lot more of my day to day. And then duties, like there was so much data teaming, and somebody mentioned conferences already tonight. Those sorts of things eat up my time and brain space as a teacher. But on the instructional design side, there's a lot of overlap. Backwards design was something that felt comfortable to me. Transitioning from teacher to ID, that model fit in my mind. It looks different whether you're using it for a course in higher ed. It looks different, if you're using it to plan training to solve an employee training problem. But it's still the idea of, all right, what's the end goal? And let's backtrack. As far as who you're working with, it changes. You're not working with kids anymore. You're working with subject matter experts or SMEs, multimedia designers. In some cases, if you're working somewhere with a big budget anyway, you'll work with program managers. So they'll be, if you're at a university, your program manager might be in charge of all of the biology, courses, or law courses. You would be working potentially with HR, right? So instructional design can be both inward and outward facing, right? So you might be training the inside of the company, or you might be creating things for your clients or your students or people outside. But as far as the research that you rely on, you reference Bloom's here, taxonomy here and there, but Clark and Mayer is still like the names that we frequently go to. My team has to go up against some strong personalities when you're designing, and sometimes subject matter experts want something a certain way because they don't see it from our perspective, and theory is what we always kind of fall back on. It's like, well, this is why I'm doing it, because it would violate this principle, or it really reduces cognitive load to present it in this order. So you use kind of that language as your argument tool to get to that compromise that makes the most sense. So that's, you're still having to have this kind of framework that you fall back on, but it shifts a little to something a little bit more specific. I'm still planning and maybe organizing materials and courses, readings, and all the multimedia that's created for a course, but that creation level varies. I've seen some instructional design positions where you're combined and you're both the media creator and the instructional designer. And then like my position when I was at Northeastern, the instructional designers were simply the planners of the multimedia. They would sketch out what they wanted it to look like, or plan it out, storyboard it, or describe it, however they communicate. But whether or not they created it may vary. So there's still some overlap. You're still planning, right? You're still kind of the one that has to keep your eyes on all the moving puzzle pieces. And I think teachers have a natural knack for that. We can kind of see where gaps are. You can see where transitions are going to fall. And as far as online tools in K-12, you may have a little bit more of this than I did as far as UI and UX. That's simply, when a user arrives at your learning resource, can they navigate it smoothly? Can they find their way through in a way that makes sense? Can you wireframe something where you're kind of planning out the bits and pieces to speak to maybe the developer who's going to build it out for you? Storyboarding is probably the biggest part of my job as an instructional designer. Like I said, we have a graphic design team, so I'm more planning out the visuals for our learning videos and then describing, like, I need this to animate in at this time, and need this character's expression to look like this, or So storyboarding is a huge thing rather than, the full creation and putting it together yourself. And things that I just didn't necessarily have to think about as a teacher that are important as an instructional designer are things like scalability. Can you take that process? We used to create 6 videos a week. Now we create 60. Can you scale up that production process in a way that still is instructionally sound, but you're going to get your courses ready on time for the fall semester, or you're going to have your training resources ready for your new group of employees. And branding and marketing. So sometimes you're like, oh, I really wish I could highlight this in another color to emphasize it more distinctly, but it's not within the color palette, and it's simply not an option. So you get a little bit more creative. And there will be times when the marketing team, at companies or even at a university may come to you and say, we'd like to put something together that teaches people, about our program or about our company. And that sort of thing was somewhat new to me. Although if you've done like marketing for school events, you'll kind of have some frame of reference. So that's, I think, the big comparison that was somewhat helpful. The other question that I know came up, when we were asking people for questions ahead of time was what types of instructional design positions exist out there? Do you have to always be the creator, or can you be more of an organizer of content? And so these are the big categories of where you see instructional design jobs. And honestly, you see them everywhere now. So higher education, you could be at the creation level, where the tools vary by the budget that's before you. Big universities are going to have more staff to help you create things. Smaller schools, you might be more of a jack of all trades. And businesses, big and small now, everybody wants their employees to be trained well. Turnover is really rough right now in all sorts of industries. So I think it's becoming more prevalent even in smaller companies to have some instructional designer paired either with HR or even each department to kind of make sure that people are onboarded correctly, and then career development. It might be that a company is growing and realizing nobody has a way up. How do we identify what skills people want to learn, and how can we bring those experiences forward? Entrepreneurial education companies, this is where I fall. I love learning, but I remember said I burnt out as a middle school teacher, so that didn't work out. And then I felt like a tiny fish in a huge ocean in Boston. So that, was just not, it was not necessarily bad. It was awesome. And I have so much to thank for that experience, but I didn't feel like me. So I sought out what's a company, what's a business, but still rooted in higher ed or K-12 or something like that. And I find that you still get to touch all the pieces of learning that you love, but it's totally more flexible. There's not really red tape in organizations or corporate settings. So if that's something that's frustrating you about K-12 or higher ed is that sort of thing, maybe you look for a corporate position, whether it's in education related field or not. So as far as what the position actually looks like, I've realized that there's kind of like this, there's a spectrum between these two pieces. And I've, said it a few times, but you're either really at the curation end or the creation end or somewhere in the middle. As far as the creation side of thing goes, it doesn't always mean that you're going to have to use the most complicated tools in the world. It might just mean that you are the one physically creating the presentations that employees will watch, whatever that is. It might mean that you are the creator using all kinds of complicated tools. My suggestion is to make sure that when you're looking for that position, decide where you want to fall on this spectrum. You don't have to be the techie designer person, as long as you have the brain that says, I understand what the outcomes are supposed to be, and I can help figure out how to get students there. I can be like the big picture organizer of that. I can ask for the things that I think would be good. I can figure out what tools do, even if I can't use them. I think that's a really good skill to have. So if you want to be a curator and be the one who works with the media designer and the subject matter expert and assembles all the puzzle pieces, you just need to know what things are out there, right? So you may not need to know how to use Storyline. You might just need to know what it's capable of so that you can describe it and then appropriately place it in the right position, in your LMS, so that students can access it. So I know there's a lot of I have some friends who are like, I've been teaching for 20 years. I don't know that I can learn all these new tools, but I know that I am a good curriculum developer. It's still totally within the skill set that a great instructional designer would have. So that is, I think, the next thing is tools and resources. And this is where my biggest panic was. I remember kind of like asking Kristen and Ruth multiple times, like, what tools, like what should I be investing in? What should I buy? And the answer was always, well, it's just going to depend. It's really just going to depend where you land. And like I said a minute ago, it's better to just kind of have a sense of what's out there and what things are capable of, more than it is to be the world's greatest storyline developer. I think. So there are, Storyline and Articulate is probably the big name software. You will only see that at very expensive, wealthy places. So as much as I wanted to play with it when I was in my instructional design program because it looked so amazing, it was certainly expensive. I did a free trial. Definitely do all the free trials in the world when you have time to really dive in. And that way you can put like working knowledge of Articulate on your resume, and that's kind of all you need, is the ability to see what's possible with it. When I was a multimedia designer at Northeastern, I used everything that's on the screen and not crossed out. Now that I'm an instructional designer, I don't use any of these. So it can be all or nothing, or somewhere in the middle in terms of how many techie tools you'll use or have access to. I should say the only one I use now is Illustrator, and that's really just to copy and paste from, unless I'm feeling super creative that day. So I think I remember asking lots of questions about these things in particular, Captivate and Storyline. And I would certainly recommend a free trial and creating even one cool thing. Maybe it's just an overview. I remember a sample project that I made in Storyline was I just made an overview of the ADDIE process. It just explained what each step was. It was clickable. It showed that I could use some of those hotspot or interactive features of Storyline, but it was not complicated. And it took me, maybe a couple hours to make it pretty and make sure that it worked. And then I didn't even upload it anywhere. I just took a screencast video, because I know that's one of the hardest things, is figuring out how to get these complicated files into a portfolio somewhere and not have it break at some point. So just take a screencast video. Maybe you narrate what your thinking was, and what design theories and choices went into it, so that we get a sense of how you frame your thinking when you're designing multimedia, right? Because that's what everybody's going to want to know when they look at your portfolio, is not so much, in my experience anyway, not so much that you're the master of that program, but that you have good, clean designs, you have a sense of what it can do, and you have an apt for whatever tools they're going to ask you to use. So if you see all of these things listed and it says you need to be an expert in them, and that's not something you're interested in becoming, maybe you don't apply for that one. There are plenty of others that, our description, my company is currently hiring lots of IDs because we're growing that fast, and we don't mention any of these programs. So you'll find positions that are all over the place. But if you are somebody who likes to design in very techie programs, absolutely dive into all the free trials you can, and you'll figure out if you can use Captivate, even decently. Using Storyline will feel like you've just upgraded, and it's even more amazing. It's like Captivate is the knockoff brand, and then Articulate Storyline is like the most incredible version of that. So if you can use one, you can very easily cross over into the other. And even, like I said, a free trial gives you sometimes 30 days, sometimes 7 days, but enough time to make something that you can then take a quick video, throw it in your portfolio, and feel like, okay, at least they know I'm competent enough to kind of figure things out. If that's a program you're interested in using and developing. What I found is once you're in, all your colleagues are super excited to teach you how to use it because they're fun tools to use. So that was not an issue. Even if I came in as a novice and the rest of my team was an expert, they were very excited to help me along the way. Also, things like PowerPoint or Keynote, they're deceptively simple, but they can actually pull off really incredible things. And I will share that we design almost exclusively in Keynote. Our graphic designers use Illustrator for the final elements for our scenes, but much of the animation is all done right in Keynote. It's not, it's just PowerPoint for Mac. So it doesn't have to be something complicated. If you'd rather just focus your energy on learning one tool well, pick something that's cheap or free. Because if you could be resourceful, any company appreciates that. If you're like, I can absolutely source out something free to get us something that looks quality, people like that stuff. And sometimes instructional design is very new, so you don't necessarily have the huge budget until you can show, like, here's how powerful learning can be for your company, and then suddenly things improve. You might argue for a new tool in that situation. As far as resources, people ask me, like, what should I read? This is still the gold standard. I know it's probably not the most exciting thing, because I think it's still probably one of your core textbooks, but it still sits on my desk every day, if that helps. It's full sections of it are in our onboarding materials. We refer to it regularly. If we're getting a lot of pushback on a design from a subject matter expert, I will cite a page number and just kind of say, like, this is why. And if you have a compelling reason that comes up against that, please, I'm all ears, but this is where it's rooted. The other one I really like is still, I don't know if this is still a text that you read, but this is one of my favorites. And this is like when you're kind of UI and UX stuff, when we're like, oh, but what if we had them click through this portal and then it would open up this? When you start finding yourself discussing really complicated things, you start to, I think of Don Norman's example of the door that he just couldn't figure out how to open. And I'm like, are we setting our students up to have a really hard time just getting to the seat or getting to the article or whatever it is? And if I think there are a ton of examples of modern instructional designers who have all the energy for podcasts and social media. So LinkedIn, you're all welcome to add me on LinkedIn. I'm not that exciting on LinkedIn, but I might have connections that are more exciting than I am. And one of them, a former colleague, is now Dr. Luke Hobson. I worked with him at Northeastern, and he is one of those people who just has all the energy in the world to talk instructional design, learning theory, new tools. If I had to pick, one new instructional designer to maybe check out and see if his style matches yours, this would be it. And he's got a little Facebook group that's growing. He has a podcast. And yeah, so this was his new book, What I Wish I Knew Before Becoming an Instructional Designer, which I think is probably similar to this conversation, because he also, is having lots of these talks about, yes, it's a real field, and here's what it is and what it's about. So just one example, but I think more a representation of that there are so many instructional designers talking about the field now that you're bound to find somebody out there who feels like that's the type of instructional designer I am. They're more curator, or they're more creator, or they fall in the middle. And I can emulate that style. Or look at everybody's portfolio that you can find. Just Google instructional design portfolios and you'll find people's, and you'll start to say, like, ooh, I really like the way that they describe this project. So Luke is one example of a great new kind of resource, but there are lots out there. So social media is great for that, but they're just articles all over. So let's see. I think getting hired, once you figure out, right, here's the type of instructional design job I think would feel right for me. The next phase is kind of tailoring your resume and your interview and your portfolio to make sure that you look, like you're ready for that kind of position. So for me, this meant kind of deep dive into my own portfolio and making sure that it was pared down to just the things that felt clean and rooted in good design. By the end of the program, the first things I designed, I was like, ooh, that I may cut from my portfolio because it no longer reflects just exactly what I wanted it to be. And portfolios help, right? But the whole thing is keeping it simple. You don't need a million things. You need a few things that show your style. And I always say, like, make sure that it looks like theory. Your visuals are really closely related to the content. I can think of an example. I saw a portfolio that had something about rocket ship. So I'm remembering the visual and not the content, which, is, like a violation of all those good design rules when you can think of the picture, but because it didn't have anything to do with the words, I can't remember the content. But all I remember is that it was a rocket ship, and that was kind of the whole storyline layout throughout the whole thing. But because it wasn't even a science thing, it had nothing to do with that content, I was just really lost. And I just looked more at that than the content itself, which, you want to make sure that anything you design just shows, I know that visuals should be timed at the same time as narration, or should be closely related and not too distracting. All those good design things. Even resumes. If your resume looks clean and organized, that's kind of your first impression as an instructional designer, weirdly enough, because sometimes you are creating organized, structured documents. So spend a little time making it feel balanced and as close to one sheet as you can get it, the way fast HR readers like them to be. But once you're working on kind of the meat of the resume, emphasize the crossover, but also the distinctions. I've realized that it's tough because you're probably up against a hiring team. Some of those might be former teachers who are rooting you on and all excited that, a teacher has teacher skills and could come over. And somebody else on the team is going to be coming from a higher ed background, or they've got their PhD in learning science and they're wondering why a teacher could now suddenly handle higher ed content. So you never really know the background of the person interviewing you, so you want to emphasize both. As a teacher, I was an expert in backwards design when it came to my own planning, and now as I've experienced the instructional design field, I see that on a scale that looks like this, and you can draw those lines and say, here's what I built on, through my instructional design program. But to appease those people who think teachers, don't have the relevant skills or whatever it is, you got to show that you're also different, that that instructional design is a unique field, and the theory that applies to it on top of being an incredible teacher, all that stuff. So yeah, shamelessly name drop Clark and Mayer. It's one of those things where there's somebody that I've interviewed with in the past, and I like wait for it. And the moment an interviewee says that, I get, my phone buzzes and he's texted me that, yes, like it happened. So yes, be prepared to discuss it a tiny bit, but mostly it's just, when I design something, I think of Clark and think Mayer, and I think like this has to be simple and it has to follow these principles. It's one of those things that does draw a distinction, but it's something that I do reference every single day, like I said, as you're trying to justify your design choices. So I became more comfortable with that once it was more in practice. It's certainly hard, I remember it being really hard to keep track of all the theories and principles when I was in the program. And then as I started designing things and having conversations with other designers about it becomes second nature. You'll have somebody ask for a bunch of extra words on screen, and you're like, no, like that violates so many theories. For this reason and that reason, it would just cause too much distraction. You've got split attention going on, you've got redundancy, and they just start to kind of rattle off, and you feel much more comfortable. So as soon as you can start to feel that, I think it's helpful. Sample projects. I remember this being terrifying when I got mine for this. I started at Quimby as an instructional designer. And then 2 years later, I became a senior instructional designer, and a year or something like later, I'm now manager of a team that will, when we're done hiring, be about 10 instructional designers. And I remember our sample project haunting me. So they may or may not be fun. They can be a little intimidating, but it usually happens after you get through a phone screening. HR may call you and say, your application looked interesting. I just wanted to get a chance to chat with you. They may ask you a couple screener questions and just get a sense of if you know what you're doing. And then you'll get sent the directions for a task and a due date. And it'll be, here's a sample script and I want you to storyboard it, or whatever it might be. And it can be a little daunting, but the best thing that I can say is they're looking to see if you've checked out their company, and if you can follow branding and emulate a style and make something clean. So if they have something that exists already, like if they're a company like mine where we create learning videos and you're tasked with storyboarding one, copy us. You know what I mean? Just rip off the company video, because the whole point is to try to say like, okay, I've seen your style. I've seen your colors. I've seen the way you some layouts you kind of use, and I'm going to try to replicate those. And include some descriptions of why, you know, like I noticed that you use this layout. I did move this image closer to the text box because I felt like that would be better on the learner. You know, you don't have to necessarily just copy, but the idea is to make sure that you've looked at the company, because for one position in a day, the next it'll be posted, and the next morning there could be 100 applicants, legitimately. So and that could happen for several days in a row. So it adds up really quickly, and you just want to make sure that when they glance at your sample project, they can tell you took the time to actually glance at their stuff too. And I think that's like step one. And then you can try to think, okay, how can I convey that I can design something that looks fresh and clean and organized and all that other stuff. But check them out, and that helps. Yeah, and then the other thing, like I mentioned, you're going to be interviewing probably with more than one person, or there's going to be more than one decision maker almost always. And you may have been the perfect candidate for one person, and they didn't have the final say, and it had to be a consensus, and it wasn't, but chances are somebody in there knew that you could do it. And that's the hard part, is that a rejection and a no hurts. And I've been rejected. I can't even count how many ID roles I've been rejected from. So if that makes anybody feel any better, there's probably a dozen that I applied to before Quimby. And most of those I didn't hear back. And I had the degree and I had some experience, and I felt like I was so wonderful, but I found my perfect fit when it was meant to be. And I know that sounds kind of dorky, but it's true. You just start to, the ones you're rejected for, probably because you just didn't, your skills didn't match what they were going to want from you, and that's not compatible on either side. You don't want those positions. So if it's a no, don't feel like you're awful. It's probably that one person said yes and one person said no. Unless it's a consensus, it's got to be a no. And over time, you'll start to tailor and say, oh, these are the companies I really want to work for, and follow them on LinkedIn. You can definitely follow a company on LinkedIn, and you'll get notifications when they post relevant jobs and things like that. Yeah, I think that's my my long ramble of everything that I can think of that I thought might be relevant, but I am most interested in answering any questions. So as soon as I figure out how to stop sharing my screen, I'm an instructional designer, I can do this. I will just open it back up for any questions that you have, or if I missed anything, Kristen, just let me know.
Thank you so much, Baylee. That was great. It was a lot of information, but I think it's all super helpful, especially talking about the portfolio piece, like what to include and how to frame things in there. Does anybody have questions? You can come off mute, or you could stick them in the chat and I'll read them out loud for you, whatever people want to do.
I just wanted to ask, and thank you, that was really helpful. I graduated, I think I was one of the first classes that graduated. I think, if not the first, Baylee, I think we might have been in some of the same classes together. And I actually am still teaching, so I didn't make the switch over, but is there anything that we could do? Like, I was jotting down some of the resources you suggested. If we're considering making the jump, what kind of like a tune-up? Like, I was like, when you were presenting, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that, but it's been 5 years.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And the thing is that the field moves so fast. So even I feel like, compared to when I was in higher ed to now, 4 years ago, things have changed in terms of what LMS, people are using. Blackboard looks totally different now than when I was last, had my hands in it. So I would suggest, thinking about what position where you ultimately want to end up, and then figuring out like what tools are relevant to that, rather than just saying what's going on. And if you don't know what's going on in ID is great. Look at eLearning Heroes and eLearning Brothers are two that come to mind. They each have kind of articles. eLearning Brothers has their own software set too, but they also have some great articles. Articulate, they have a whole forum and community. So you can kind of find, and like I said, just Google around and you can kind of see if if you're not sure what the position, in your head looks like that you want as far as an idea, start by just scanning and seeing, what are current trends. And once you narrow it down, you're like, okay, I really think higher ed is where I want to be. I want to be at a university. Then you can start to look, okay, do I want a big university where they're probably going to use Articulate and Adobe stuff? Or do I want a small university, where they may have access to, they may use simpler tools anyway, right? So I would start by figuring out what kind of position you want and then getting into the tools and stuff from there. But honestly, it moves fast. And I think the best skill is just to be able to kind of say, I'm going to download a free trial of this and try it out, and then jot down some notes on it. That way it will eventually come up somewhere, some way, in some position where, hey, maybe we should try Rise. And you could see like, oh, I did a free trial on that. And actually it works well for this. So it's hard though. I think once you find like a couple instructional designers that you just really like on social media or wherever it is, they help keep you in the loop. Luke is my go-to. Like I said, he's got all the energy to just keep talking. So he keeps me in the loop. In addition to, I really like the research side of things. So I do, I have access to academic journals. I post articles regularly for my team. So as far as the research side of stuff, you can always pull, just search. I don't know if you have access still to a university database or not, but you can even use Google Scholar. Is sometimes great. So looking for just current instructional design articles. There was one this morning to get a little instructional design nerdy with all of you that I posted for my team, because we were talking about a lot of our videos contain kind of like funny scenes. They're court cases. Funny things happen in law. So we try to include some illustrated scenes that have silly things happening. We have kind of a fan club on Instagram. It's called No Context Quimby, and it's just still shots of funny scenes. And we were talking about, we have this thing in our head of, oh, that would be so funny. And then you're like, no, that's just too much. We got to dial it down to what's actually efficient for learning. So there's a theory that combines cognitive theory, multimedia learning with some social emotional stuff. And it's the Castle theory, which I will only remember because of its wonderful acronym. But it combines the elements of interest, influencing just your capacity for learning, and kind of looking at how you can trigger social cues to make people feel like they're talking to other people. Because when you feel like you're engaged in a social learning experience, your ability to learn expands. So some of these articles are just good to stay, involved with, because it's the core of what we already knew, back in 2000, I don't know, 2017, feels so long ago. But then it just adds in some of these other pieces that I'm like, we knew that, I knew when I liked something, I could learn it way easier, or, those little things. So research is one area, but then also, follow your favorite ideas. And there are some people who just have the energy to keep up with all of it and they'll help.
Thank you.
I posted some links in the chat to a couple of the things you were talking about, Baylee. And Connie Malamed is someone who a lot of my newer students often talk about. They follow her blog, or I don't know if she comes up when you start searching for instructional design, because her name keeps coming up. Recently, students have said they find her articles really useful, so that might be a website to check out. And her work. I think she also has a podcast, so if that's your preferred method of content consumption. Any other questions?
Hi, Kristen. This is Danisa. Hi, Baylee. Hi, everyone. I don't have a question, but I have a comment on something that Baylee mentioned. Once you decide to pursue the path of being an instructional designer, and then you start applying for those positions, and you actually land the position, one thing to keep in mind is, like Baylee said, you don't necessarily have to know how to do everything, how to use all the tools. You're not going to know everything, and the industry changes so frequently. You're constantly learning, you're constantly growing. And the one thing that I've found is that it's a community. Like your coworkers, your peers, they are so willing to help you. So it's like at any time I know I can go to Marisa or whoever else, and who may be very knowledgeable about a topic or a principle or a tool, and they're more than willing to help. So that's one saving grace, and one thing that sticks with me is that I know I'm not alone, and that people are so willing to help. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's been true in everywhere I've been. Yeah, that's been true at every level. That was true when I walked into Northeastern, just fresh out of, QU. So I think maybe it's just people who love to talk about learning know that they need to help other people learn and are just nicer, something like that. That's my theory. But that's a great point. Yeah. You're not going to know everything, and it's okay, because we tend to be a warm and fuzzy field. We really do. So hopefully that's good.
Yeah, thanks, Denise. And I plugged your webinar right before you came on. So Denise will be speaking on April 26th, right? In a couple weeks.
Yep. Thanks.
So yeah, I think that's an important point, is that no one can know every tool that's out there. And if you see a job that's asking for something very specific, like Baylee was saying, it's good to kind of know what that tool does, so that you can say, well, I haven't worked with this, but I have worked with this other tool that does the same thing. So just kind of keeping your eye on the different tools and being able to put them into categories, because most of those skills are transferable. And if you can talk about how you're able to pick up tools quickly, that's going to work as an asset to your advantage. I was going to ask too, Baylee, were you trained? I'm sure they're always willing to train you on anything that you don't know as well.
Yeah, that was, at Northeastern, they had access to lynda.com training videos. So it was pretty much anytime there was downtime, I could go and watch like the specific section on, if I just couldn't figure out how to do one thing in Storyline or one thing in Illustrator, that would make my life so much easier. I could go and watch that particular piece. And then I could, if I was still stuck, I always had a teammate that I could rely on. So yeah, there's lots of learning resources for all that stuff.
Any other questions? I know it's daunting and it's a lot, but for those of you in the program, we'll continue to work with you on your portfolio. I'm happy to look at portfolios at any point in the program. We kind of start it early, and then people add things throughout, and we do a comprehensive review of it in the capstone. But at any point, if you're looking for jobs, even before you graduate, just shoot me your portfolio and I'll take a look. And Heather too, anyone who's out of the program or who's been out of the program, Ruth and I are always here. Once you're in the program, we're lifelong friends. So just reach out if that you're looking for resources, or if you need a reference or a portfolio review or anything like that. We're happy to continue doing those things.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Anyone else? If not, I won't drag everybody's night out. I know people are, all of you, probably most of you were teaching in a classroom this morning, so I'm sure you're ready to get to bed and get ready to do it again tomorrow. So thank you so much, Baylee, for sharing all of that. I think it was wonderful. And thank you all for being here tonight, and I'll stick around for another couple minutes.
Sorry, I did just see one question in the chat, and I thought I think I glossed right over it. It just does ask if we work remotely, which is a great question. When I was at Northeastern, I was split half and half. I know that now they do allow some of their instructional designers to be fully remote. An instructional designer at a university, though, sometimes has to help the faculty who are less technologically inclined. So sometimes they are more hybrid positions because they want you to be available to go in and really troubleshoot with those people who need, one-on-one support, who just, it's too daunting to get there. I had a professor who once taught the same thing for 43 years, and then they asked him to move it online. And we spent a lot of time one-on-one. So that was 50% remote, and sometimes more or less, depending. And now my entire company is fully remote. It's never had an office. It was remote first, and we have employees in like a dozen different countries. We are all asynchronous. And we have there are different types of remote work. Some remote work, they still kind of monitor to make sure that you're working business hours. It's good to clarify when you're applying for remote positions. sometimes they want to see your little green light on Slack, which is a little intimidating. It's the, a common communication tool if you haven't used Slack. And they want to see that you're at your desk and you're active and available. That was my experience at a university, but not every university. So you can ask those types of questions. Now we're so asynchronous. As the manager of the team, I don't care if their light is green or not. I know that we hire people that we trust will meet, deadlines, and we're in constant communication when it's convenient. So totally remote, totally asynchronous. And we have weekly due dates so people can work the hours they want. And it was a super culture shock coming from being a teacher who was, working all the time. So you will be like, wait, my to-do list is done. I don't understand how that works. I just got to the end of my list and it's done. And sometimes that's a big transition, but yeah, fully remote positions are, I see so many remote positions popping up now. But different companies offer different salaries. So sometimes remote positions, they really try to lowball salaries. You look at a company's hiring philosophy is usually posted somewhere, and they may say like, no, despite being remote, we offer competitive salaries. We want people we trust. And that's good language to look for. Some remote positions, they'll hire entry level for very low salary. And you just want to make sure that what you're getting into is going to be worth your time and energy too. So just something to keep in mind as more and more remote positions pop up. But yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Baylee, for your time tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.